Our keynote speaker tonight is David Rothkopf, who is one busy man. He is CEO and editor of the FP Group, which publishes Foreign Policy, and a magazine that's in great demand. He's also president and CEO of Garten, Rothkopf, an international firm that focuses on critical trends associated with energy, security, emerging markets, things you'll be talking about in your meetings tomorrow that you will begin. And he's also a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he chairs the Economic Strategic Roundtable. And in addition, he is a member of the advisory boards of a number of international organizations. He has had government experience, having served in the Clinton administration, first as deputy and then as acting Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Policy, and Development. And in spite of this very busy schedule, he is the author of a number of internationally acclaimed volumes, most recently, National Insecurity, Americans' Leadership in an Era of Fear, published just this past October. And he writes a weekly column for Foreign Policy, is a regular columnist for CNN and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, just to name a few. So you're all going to have a treat, and so let me welcome David Rothkopf to the microphone, who has graciously said that he would take a few questions following his remarks, and I'll let him decide just how much time he wants to allocate to his presentation and moving into questions. David.
Good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the second time that I've had the opportunity to address this group. I enjoyed it very much the last time, and I enjoyed the question and answer session the most, so I'm going to try to get to that fairly quickly. The work of the National Committee is an important work. The work of bringing you all together is important work. It's a special pleasure to be introduced by Ambassador Hills, who really is one of the most distinguished international public servants the United States has produced in many decades, and really is responsible for a lot of the innovation that has taken place in U.S. trade policy, affecting it even today, to the extent that we have trade policy, which we could discuss that if you like. I think the parameters that Minister Councillor Zhou spoke about are kind of the parameters that I'd like to talk about. But of course, if we get to the end, I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got. I think you come to Washington at a very interesting moment. Now, some of you may think I mean an interesting moment because of what you see in the newspapers, that there is political upheaval, that somehow Washington thinks it's already 2016 and every story is about a presidential election that's going to take place in 18 months. Or perhaps it's because we have a war or wars in the Middle East. In fact, the Middle East right now has a level of conflict and unease that we have never seen before in the history of the world. Every single country in the Middle East, with the exception of Oman, is involved in a military conflict right now. This is really unprecedented. And at the same time, we have challenges all around the world which dominate people's attention, from Ukraine to the South China Sea. All of these things may make this seem like interesting times. But that's not really why I think it's an interesting time. I think it's an interesting moment because I think the United States and many of our allies have spent much of the past 15 years, the first 15 years of the 21st century, fighting the last wars of the 20th century, dealing with the residual issues of the 20th century. The struggles that are taking place in the Middle East right now are the struggles of countries unable to come to grips with modernity, unable to adapt to the changes that are taking place in the world. You may view them as terrorism, you may view the governments as authoritarian, you may view the unrest through a lot of lenses. But through a historical lens, you have to see them as a residual of the past and not a precursor of the future. When Minister Councillor Zhou made his remarks, he concluded with innovation. And as students and as people who are embarking on their careers, I think that is where we all must begin. Because there have been changes afoot over the course not only of the past 15 years, but over the course perhaps of the past 25 years, that are profound, that are not well understood, and that will define the world over the course of your careers to a far greater extent than any of the things I've just mentioned have. You know, if you go to a group of Americans, if you go to people in many countries, and you say, over the past 25 years, what are the most important developments? What are the developments that have changed the world the most? Half of them, the older half, you know who you are, might say it was the fall of the Soviet Union. It was the end of the Cold War. And that was the big watershed of the past 25 years. Another group, particularly in the United States, might say it was 9/11. It was the attack that showed the United States was vulnerable in this new era to suffer the consequences of problems that took place far, far away. But I think neither of those two things is the biggest development that's happened in the world in the past 25 years. I think the biggest development is that in 1990, when you were in office, there were 12 million cell phones in the world. And last October, we passed the point when there were more cell phones or cellular devices on the planet than people. That we are at a point where we are just a couple of years away, because of cell phone penetration and because half the phones sold in the world each year going forward are smartphones. We're at a point where within a couple of years, for the first time in human history, every single individual on the planet will effectively be connected in a man-made system for the very first time. That changes everything. It changes your sense of identity. It changes your sense of community. It changes your sense of nation. It changes our sense of what is international. As I was listening to the two sponsors speak a little bit, I was thinking that within Hershey or within ACE, the people who are dealing in China and the people who are dealing in the United States are not viewing themselves as separate. They are joined together in a global enterprise, and there are no boundaries within that. Now that may sound like, and one of these old ideas from the glory days of globalization, which seem to have come and gone. But it's not. Barriers are coming down to change the way that we think of ourselves. But the technological changes that have happened in the past 25 years are just prelude. And sometimes the way I like to describe it is to say that today is the day before the Renaissance. Today is as if we were in the moments before an epochal change, a change of such scope that it's hard for us to grasp it. And you might think, well, this is hyperbole. This is greater than what I might expect. But I would argue that it's not. Because every single aspect of life on the planet as we know it is about to change in profound ways that will demand new thinking, new philosophies, new strategies, new paradigms, new metrics. And it goes across every boundary. War, peace, markets, economies, issues like what is money, what is citizenship, what are fundamental rights, what are international organizations. What is privacy? All of these things are going to change in profound ways very, very soon, in much greater ways than they've changed thus far. We've seen it in the U.S. China relationship. Right now there's tension in the U.S. China relationship over cyber issues, which we've narrowly defined. And you might say, well, this is the cyber era, but this is not what I mean. But even within the very narrow definition of it, when one country attacks another with a cyber attack, we don't know what is the appropriate response. We don't have a doctrine. We don't know what deterrents are. We don't have legal mechanisms. We don't have definitions. We don't have the vocabulary. We don't have senior government officials who are even able to talk about this. I spoke to the former head of the National Security Agency about this when I was doing my last book. And he said that when he would go in and brief senior U.S. government officials, they looked at him like he was a character out of the American movie Rain Man. Okay? In other words, people did not understand the words that were coming out of his mouth because they didn't have the vocabulary to understand this. But, it raises big questions. It's not just if a country attacks another country with cyber, can that country respond kinetically? It's what if we've gone from Cold War to Cool War? What if we've gone from a world in which conflict was so costly that we didn't dare undertake it, to a world in which conflict is so cheap that we don't dare stop? Well, you might say it's not as dangerous because it's low-level conflict. But if everybody is in low-level conflict all the time, including friends, constantly sort of intruding in their lives of their allies, there's tension fraught within that system. But what we're talking about goes much, much, much beyond going from Cold War to Cool War, just dealing with cyber issues. We once had an idea of globalization. Back in the day when Carla was sort of driving the changes that were coming in terms of global trade, and we were, getting to the Uruguay round, and those were the glory days. Everything was going to be great, globalization, everybody was going to adopt a set of rules, and barriers weren't going to come down. And then the internet came along. And we thought the internet, that's going to open up more boundaries, knock down more borders, connect more people. It'll be more opening. That's not what's happening, is it? It's not happening. After the NSA and the Snowden revelations, country after country around the world said, wait a minute, I don't know if we want to play this way. I think we need to set our own rules for the internet. And we are coming to an era in which one of the fundamental divides isn't the old Cold War divide, it's the divide between countries with a cyber internationalist view, let's connect everybody with this, and those with a cyber nationalist view. The internet exists within our borders, and we are going to define it. And I have to say, this goes right to the issue of respect, and this is one of those hard issues that the U.S. and China are going to have to talk about and ultimately resolve, because how it is resolved between the U.S. and China will be how it is resolved within the world. But on this issue of internet governance, which is not a remote issue, most of the economy of the world is now conducted in exchanges of bits and bytes. So barriers to bits and bytes are barriers to trade and to growth and to job creation and to stability. And when you look at that, we in the United States, we have a very narcissistic worldview. When I worked with Henry Kissinger, one of Henry Kissinger's lines that he would use all the time was that most Americans have the delusion that foreigners, when given a chance, would like to make their country just like the United States. You're supposed to laugh at that, but this was the belief that, and I think it is the belief that a lot of people have. And I call it national narcissism. We think the world wants to be like us, we think it will become like us, and we think our view will ultimately prevail. But history says something different. History says that the center of intellectual gravity on the planet travels with the center of economic gravity. And as it went from Europe to the United States, so did the leadership on a lot of issues. And now the center of economic gravity is traveling across the Pacific. And I don't think that we can expect that the resolution of these issues is going to be purely on American terms. And so when you talk about an issue like internet governance, where China has a very different view than the United States, it's not just China that has this view. It's not just states that we might characterize as authoritarian as states that have this view. Today it's China and it's Singapore, it's Israel and it's Saudi Arabia, it's the United Arab Emirates and it's Brazil. You know, when after the NSA scandal, the Brazilians said, we will not use U.S. software on anything that connects to our government. Cost Microsoft $1 billion, one decision. They and the other BRICS said we're going to have a different internet backbone. I don't have any illusion that the future resolution of this issue is going to be the American view. I think it's likely to be something of a hybrid. How that works out is going to be one of the great big questions going forward. But it's not just internet governance or cyber conflict. I had a group of central bank governors in my office a few months ago, and we were talking about the changes that were coming. And they cited one change that was in the works as the biggest change that would hit international finance since the advent of paper money. And that's mobile money. That's the ability to carry your phone in your pocket. To carry your bank in your pocket, right? There are 1.8 billion people on the planet who don't have access to a bank account. They probably will never have access to a bank account. Because before somebody gets around to building a bank branch in their village, somebody's going to put an app in their phone. And that app is going to contain their balance, allow them to borrow, allow them to transfer money, allow them to pay, and governments are going to love it. The central bank governor of Peru said they would send checks to people on the other side of the other side of the Andes, and it would often cost more to get the check to the person on the other side of the Andes than was the value of the check, right? And when the person got the check, it would arrive on a Tuesday, and they'd bring it to cash it in town and buy things. Every storekeeper in the village knew that the check was coming. So guess what? The prices went up. So there was a kind of an artificial tax. Now they wire the money to somebody's cell phone. They have no cost in distributing that money. And the villager doesn't bear the tax. You know? And this, where is this happening? Is this being led from the United States? No. It's being led from Tanzania and Kenya. Those are the hotbeds of development in mobile money. It's happening someplace else. And I was talking to the CEO of a very, very big household name company the other day that's in the logistics and delivery business. And he's now sitting down with the bank because he says, I have the whole supply chain. Why don't I also have the payment system built within my company? Why am I not the bank? And so I think there's going to be a revolution in financial services that's going to change the nature of money. The same is going to be true with health services delivery. The same is going to be true with education. We live in an era in which rooms are built like this. It's a lovely room. It's a nice program. I'm not, saying anything about it. But the way the classrooms in every university in which you're studying are designed are based on an idea for education that was the same at the University of Bologna in the year 1000, right? The sage on the stage. Somebody stands up in front of the room and speaks to an audience, and they train them for a few years, and then they leave. Now, in the University of Bologna, when you left at age 16, 17, or 18, you had a life expectancy of 18 more years. So the education you had would carry you through your whole life. But now when you leave, you have a life expectancy of 50 more years, and the world is changing 5 times as fast, and you're going to have to adapt to a whole bunch of new jobs. And it doesn't make sense for you to be educated in a room like this. But we don't have new models. We don't have them yet. We don't know what they are. But you're going to have lifelong education, and you're going to have a different model for that education. And that's going to change the way the world works. I could go on, but even at the most fundamental levels, There are questions that have to be asked for dealing in this world that are not being asked. For example, if you were writing a constitution for a government right now, would you ask, do you have a right to the internet? Now, you can't have a job without being on the internet. You won't be able to be a citizen without being on the internet. You won't be able to get health services or be educated without being on the internet. You can't have a full life without being on the internet. Now, I'm not saying how the internet is regulated. I'm just saying, do you have a right to it? Just like you have a right to a free press in many countries. And I think the answer is going to be yes. People have to have a right to the internet because otherwise they can't have full lives. Well, if you have a right to the internet, does that mean you have to have a right to electricity? There's 1.2 billion people on the planet who don't have electricity. If you don't have electricity, you don't have a phone, you don't have a computer, you don't have access to the internet. So you can't be, now it used to be you didn't need that. Electricity was a luxury, but we now live in a world where electricity is a necessity of 21st century citizenship, regardless of the system in which you're operating. So that requires a different level of thinking. We have to resolve fundamental issues. The most fundamental question in some respects of the new economy is who owns the data? And by that, as you go into the big data era, you know that everything's going to have sensors. You, today, in your life, are emitting data like it's a fountain coming out of your body. There's data coming out of your phone. There's data coming out of your computer. There's data coming out of your car. There's data coming out of appliances in your house. There's data coming out of your company. And it says who you are, who you know, what you buy, what you're interested in. Do you own that data? Because that has economic value. Or does the company that sends out the data own it? A company that captures the data own it? Does the government own it? I mean, the government's going to say it wants it. With surveillance, the government wants it. We're going to get to a point with healthcare where everybody's got a thing in their device that tells you what their physical fitness is. And when there's an outbreak of a disease, the government's going to say, well, anybody who's got a temperature over 102 is going to have to stay home, and we know who you are. And you know, that's a question that we are going to have to come to grips with in the context of this era. Privacy is a question. We have a view in the United States that you're giving away your data unless you say you're not. In Europe, they have a view that says you have to explicitly say you're going to give it away. How's that going to get resolved? How that gets resolved is going to determine fundamental economic issues. Say you're a company like General Electric, okay? You have jet engines, power plants, and MRI machines. In each one of those, there's sensors. They're throwing off data all the time. The data that they are throwing off is hugely valuable. GE has more real-time information on what's going on in the economy than any government, by far. So does Visa, so does MasterCard. All of them are sitting in oceans of information real-time. You could have data on economy. You know, we have data. The U.S. government puts out economic data once a quarter. Washington insiders know two things about that data. It's late and it's wrong. You know, it's the wrong metrics. It's based on the wrong things. But these companies are going to have real-time data, and they're going to monetize that data. People have gone to GE and say, give away the jet engine, sell the data, because it's so valuable. Well, that's great. But if you go and buy a share of GE stock and you look in the prospectus for GE, that data asset of GE, that's not in the balance sheet. We haven't come up with, accountants don't know how to value this. So what I'm trying to do in the course of 20 minutes here is to say war is changing, peace is changing, money is changing, an economy is changing, fundamental rights are changing, the relationships between nations are being changed by these things, and I've only talked about the IT part of it. And the bio side of it, and you won't talk to anybody tomorrow. I know you're going to talk to a lot of smart people tomorrow. But in Washington, we have a deficit of people who understand science and technology. In Beijing, in the government, whatever its strengths and weaknesses may be, you got a lot of engineers. People understand this stuff. In Washington, we have a lot of lawyers, We have a lot of lawyers. And, but we need to have conversations about different kinds of things. 70%, and I don't say this to be inflammatory, I just say it to make an observation. 70% of the active pharmacological ingredients in drugs taken in the United States are made in China. 70%. We've already seen with different kinds of things that when there's a crisis someplace, the countries that manufacture these things have a special advantage. The countries that are importing these things are at a special disadvantage. Same is true with chipsets for fighter planes. The same is true with a lot of other things where there are strategic imbalances involved in these relationships that we need. China has been incredibly innovative in a whole host of things where we are lagging behind. There's that organization in Beijing that has 35% of all the mapped genomes in the planet. They cornered the market. Chinese government's in the midst of this big program of mapping genomes of babies born in China. This is an area where the biggest database wins. The biggest programs in the United States doing this right now have 200 or 300 or 400 participants. Okay? But mapping genomes is how you know where diseases are, how people are going to live, how we are going to have costs for the government in the future, what the quality of life is going to be. It changes whole masses of things. And the United States right now is lagging behind in some of those things. So what I'm getting at in here is, you might have thought, well, he's the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and he writes books on foreign policy, and he's going to talk about the State Department. Okay? Foreign policy is not made in the State Department. Foreign policy is not made in the White House. Foreign policy is not made in the U.S. government. Foreign policy isn't even foreign anymore. What we are talking about is global affairs and global relations are driven by individuals who are connected to other individuals, communities that spring up overnight on the internet that are connected to other communities, some for good, some for bad. ISIS is a revolution in terrorism because they're the first open architecture terrorist group. Anybody can join. I'm not suggesting it, but anybody can join. It's not a hierarchic organization in the past. They'll take franchises. It enables them to grow extremely rapidly. The character of the threat is changing because of the character of the interrelationship. All these things that I'm talking about. We have on the mobile money issue, banks go to their regulators that are central banks and say, hey, keep those telecom companies from taking over my space. Telecom companies go to the telecom regulators and say, we want to get into this space. But there's nobody in the telecom regulator who understands banking, and there's nobody in the central bank who understands telecom. So there's going to be a battle. We're going to fight this out. We're going to fight out the future of internet governance and internet trade and what the new metrics are and how we're going to work together and how we define a society and how we collaborate. The Minister Counselor is exactly right. The 21st century will be defined by the nature of collaboration between the United States and China. It is the central relationship. And when I was in the Clinton administration in 1993, we said this is the central relationship. And I'm sure you said this is going to be the central relationship. And sooner or later, somebody's going to say it and believe it. We've pushed it this, we've pushed it, and then we go and fight the fire. Because as Sandy Berger, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, said, in Washington, the urgent always overtakes the important. Okay? But what I'm talking to you about is the important. What I'm talking about are the changes that are going to define the future of your life. And I don't believe that those changes are going to be defined within the traditional parameters of government, because the people who understand these forces don't exist in the public sector. They exist primarily in the private sector. And so we need new public-private collaboration. And many of them exist across borders. And we need new international levels of cooperation. We need new kinds of relationships. It requires a new framework for thinking. It requires philosophers. It requires people, it was 320 years from Gutenberg printing press, first Bible, to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And in the middle there was a lot of upheaval and John Locke and the Glorious Revolution, a lot of thinking about what the role of the press was, and it's not resolved worldwide even to this day. And we're 10, 15 years into this. 10, 15 years, and yet things are happening so fast that we need to have the philosophical discussions, the political discussions, the economic policy discussions, the military doctrine discussions, the international relations discussions, to enable us to cope with these changes in a way that is not as disruptive as it could be. Because typically when big changes like this happen, we go through a period of turbulence that can be devastating. And the secret to the mutual success of everybody in this room is going to be anticipating these changes and taking the steps necessary to prepare for them, rather than having them cause that disruption and have costs that are potentially grievously high for all of us. In any event, on that cheerful note, I'd be very happy to take questions about anything, including traditional foreign policy or Washington, if you would like. Yes, sir.
Please wait for the microphone and tell us your name, the school you're from, and what you study.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mingda from the School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California, San Diego. So first of all, I want to make a comment on your the way you express the idea of American delusion that Americans believe that if any foreign countries, any foreign people, if they were given a choice, they will do something or they will learn something from the United States. And you call it American narcissism. And when I learned this in my college, my professor called it American exceptionalism, which is a rather powerful word. Then my next is really my question. So since I have done research related to cybersecurity and cyber strategy, and you have talked about this cybersecurity issue, I want to press it harder. From my knowledge, I have learned that the United States is the first country that formally established a U.S. Cyber Command, which is part of the U.S. military. And from my knowledge so far, I didn't see the Chinese government has formally acknowledged such maybe identical or similar existence, such a unit in China. And another anecdote I want to bring about is that after the acute North Korean attack on Sony last year, then we observed that the internet accessibility to North Korea has been cut for several days, and there were a lot of speculation that it was a counterattack from the United States. So my question is, isn't the United States making use of this fast development of technology and taking a unilateral step in response to this new challenge without coordinating or communicating with other countries? Thank you.
No. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, I'm sorry. If that's your view, that's great. But, and believe what you will. But the United States is not the only country undertaking, explorations in the cyber world. The Iranians are attacking us. The Syrian Free Electronic Army is attacking us. The Russians are attacking us. The Chinese are attacking us. And we are doing it to them, too. And I don't think we achieve anything by saying, oh, no, you started it. No, you started it. Or you're the only ones. Or you gave it a name. Okay? This is happening. This is the world. This is what's going on. And, if you want to go and become a spokesperson for the Chinese government, then your view is a perfectly good view to have. But if what you want to do is analyze it and try to understand it, then set the politics aside at the door and say, where does this lead? Where does it lead when governments can attack each other and then deny that they attacked? Where does it lead when most of the attacks are on the private sector and many in the private sector don't want to even admit that they were attacked? Where does it lead when most of the points of penetration are in the private sector and they've got to do the defending and we don't have the mechanisms for the public sector and the private sector to coordinate? Where does it lead when we don't have a doctrine to coordinate international responses and set international standards for those responses? Where does it lead when we don't have international institutions to deal with this world. We've got arms control institutions that deal with the arms technologies of the 1950s, not terribly well, by the way, but we have those. But we don't have them to deal with this. These are the big questions. The big questions are not the political posturing of today. The big questions are how do we set the frameworks to have a more livable world in the future and reduce the likelihood that these new technologies and new forms of conflict produce irritation and tension that erupt into using the old forms of conflict.
Thank you.
Yes. Whoever has the microphone is in charge. So, yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hillary He Qingqing, and I'm a Master of Science student at the Columbia Journalism School. Thank you very much, Mr. Rothkopf, for such a thought-provoking conversation.
Did you know I went to the Columbia Journalism School?
Oh my gosh, I did not know that.
Yeah, sure. I told her to ask this question.
So taking foreign policy as an example, as digitalization encroaches upon all the aspects of our lives, there is more of a need to filter the sea of information out there in order to cater to everybody's different preferences and values, etc. What has foreign policy done in the past few years, and going forward, what would be the outlook of the differences that it'll make in terms of audience engagement that'll maximize the impact that it's trying to make?
With our publication specifically?
Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, one of the things that, first of all, Foreign Policy used to be a magazine. It's come out for 50 years. It was created, or almost 50 years. It was created by Samuel Huntington, to offer a counterpoint to Foreign Affairs, which is the magazine that counts on foreign relations, at the time of the Vietnam War. And for the first 35, 40 years of its history, it was a little journal. And then it became a big journal, and then it added pictures. It was really revolutionary. This was about 10 years ago. And then it went onto the internet 5 or 6 years ago. And it went from 100,000 readers to 6 million. So we now have 6 million people reading the stuff that we put out. We put out more stories each morning and each afternoon than used to be in each issue of the publication. And 45% of our audience is outside the United States. So 45% of our readers are somebody else, and we are dealing with them in real time. Well, the biggest change that I've seen as essential in that is if we are covering the world for the world, we have to look like the world. And so, in my view, this has meant more writers from outside the United States, more diversity among the writers, more diversity among voices. One of my particular pursuits has had to do with the fact that and I'm not going to get into a big political polemic here, but I will say that in my view, the single greatest crime humanity has committed has been the systematic repression of women since the beginning of time. That the majority of population is still grotesquely underrepresented in government, in business, in finance, in journalism, is completely inappropriate, and you can't have a functioning society unless you balance that out. So half of our writers are women, half of our editors are women. Every event we do has women on every panel. Half of our columnists are women, and this is part of what I think is essential in dealing with a global community, that you have the voices of that community reflected in what we are doing. And the future of foreign policy is in responding in real time to readers by providing them with what they want. And some of that's going to be video, and some of it's going to be podcast, and some of it's going to be print, and some of it's going to be on the web. There was an American media scholar in the 1960s named Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan said, "The medium is the message." And my view is, 50 years later, that that's wrong. The message is the message, and you just choose the medium in order to deliver it in the way that the end reader wants.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. My name is Chex Yu, and I'm a graduate student studying economics and public policy at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. So you talked a lot about increasing level of global connectivity. So given that premise or fact, I think at least I'm hopeful that people in this room, people who've experienced very different education systems, to be at a comparative advantage in terms of leveraging that trend. But at the same time, one of the primary questions that most of us have at the back of our minds is, when I graduate, should I, keep being in the United States, or should I go back to China? And in the perfect world, I think that question would be so relevant, because we would all be contributing to the global public good. But given that's not the reality, I was wondering whether you have any advice on how should we position ourselves, and how should we leverage that trend given the maybe relative comparative advantage that we might have?
Well, look, like it's the same answer as to the first question. No, I don't know. I don't know how to help you. Because I think that's a very personal question. And it has to do with your own personal needs. I've been asked by many people what they should do, how they should manage their careers, and I found that there are three good rules that apply to people who are starting out in their careers, and that is, always go to the center, not the center of a country, but go to the center of where what you're interested in is happening. Go to the hub of where what you're interested in is happening, where the most action and the most intense intellectual activity is. Always go to quality. Always go to the best organization that you can possibly go to, the one with the best reputation, the one that is, because that will reflect on you as you go, and there's probably a reason for the best reputation. And above all, always go to people. Because at the end of the day, it's the people you work with and the person who is your immediate mentor, and whether they take an interest in you and whether they will help cultivate you along your path, that will ultimately determine whether you are cultivated and whether you are able to move quickly up. And frankly, that's going to be different places for different people. And it's going to be different places at different times in your life. I think you have to know that. It has to be a personal kind of a decision. I tend to be optimistic. Even if I sounded like I touched upon a number of challenges that we face, I think that if you are intellectually rigorous and you study history, the conclusion that you have to come to, above all else, is that the prevailing trend is progress. That there have been horrible developments throughout history. There have been wars and famines and genocide and repression. But at the end of the day, every 100 years has moved people forward. Today, people live longer, they are better off, they have more options, they have more access to information, there are fewer wars, there are fewer people dying of conflict, there are fewer diseases that can kill people, and the same is going to be true in 100 years. And that is why I believe that it is also likely that the future of the U.S. China relationship is better than the past of the U.S. China relationship, and that the level of cooperation within the relationship is likely to increase, and the level of interconnection is likely to increase, and that's the antidote. And there's just been a paper, so I'm sure some people are going to talk about it in the course, published by, I guess it was the Council on Foreign Relations, just put out a study that sort of suggested that, conflict is around the corner. I just don't see it that way. I think there are issues where there will be differences. But people make this sort of false Cold War analogy, because that's the only model that we've got. We have the US and Russia. But that was a zero-sum game. If they lost, we gained. China and the US are completely interdependent with each other. We are like giant Siamese twins, connected at all of our vital organs. We cannot hurt China without hurting ourselves. China cannot hurt us without hurting ourselves. We may not like it, we may not agree on everything, but all the things that are in our fundamental interests push us together. And so that's relevant to your question in the sense that if you spent 3 years here, you might spend 10 years there. You know, you will go, I think there will be much more mobility and fluidity over time than there is right now.
Hi, I'm Phoenix. I'm Wang Chi. I'm a grad student at the Department of Sociology at Harvard. I have one question. I think it's both challenging and exciting to know that, you know, the technology, the advances in technology demand, new philosophy and frame of thinking. But if you look at the past, seems like, you know, the automobiles were invented and the phones were invented and, you know, new medicines were invented. But at the end, seems like every time there's some sort of exciting opportunity, the winners of the end game are the big companies. Seems like at the end, always those companies that can pay more and better lobbyists up on the hill that got more interest or most interest out of it. So I think, what do you think of this prediction of, you know, on one hand, there's exciting opportunities and the complexity of the new problems and challenges, but in the political process and, you know, other things that are part of the structure right here in DC that might actually cancel out whatever efforts you make to have that kind of framework and and philosophy. That's my question. Thank you.
I think it's a profoundly important question. The reality is that companies are designed for global existence in a way that countries are not designed for global existence. Companies thrive in it. And there has been very little in the course of human history that compares to the ascent of corporations over the past 200 years. In fact, I wrote a book on it called Power Inc., and I'm not going to get into all of the things, but it talked about the rise. Now, one of the things that I talk about in that is, you know, there was a theory at the end of the Cold War that was offered by Francis Fukuyama that we had sort of come to the end of history, and that we had resolved everything, and everything was going to work its way out as kind of this liberal view that, you know, markets ultimately dictated everything. And that we had defeated communism and communism was gone, and we'd resolved the big issue. But of course we haven't resolved the big issue. We haven't resolved the big issue because of the issues that you're talking about. Because inequality is growing in many places. Because power is heavily concentrated in the private sector in many places. Because there are different views towards the role of the public sector and the role of government in many places. And in fact, what I assert in the book is that we've gone from communism versus capitalism to a competition among many different kinds of capitalism. There's capitalism with Chinese characteristics. There's large developing economy capitalism like you see in India or Brazil, which has a big social component. There's small entrepreneurial economy capitalism like you see in Singapore, the UAE, or Israel. There's Northern European capitalism, quite different from Southern European capitalism. They all have a different view of what's the role of the public sector, what's the role of the private sector, how do you balance the role of the individual and the role of the community? And I think it's a very important discussion, and candidly, my view is that for the same reason that I said the intellectual center of gravity is going to shift, that we may enter a period in which something that's sort of a hybrid between the American view and the Asian view ends up prevailing, where there is more balance. But I have to say, right now, all big economies face a crisis. And it's one way in the United States and it's one way in China. And the crisis has to do with hyperproductivity and the ability to grow without creating jobs. In the United States, for the past 40 years, wages have essentially remained flat. For the past 15 years, for the first time in U.S. history, GDP has grown and productivity has grown, but effectively jobs have not grown. Okay, and that's because productivity has sort of gutted the middle, and we don't know what to do about that yet. Nobody's got a good solution as to where you create those jobs or what those jobs are going to look like. And only 12% of the jobs in this country are manufacturing jobs. Well, the country that's the biggest buyer and producer of robotics in the world is China. China's got 400 million unemployed and underemployed people who are expecting that growth was going to produce a big boom in jobs. What's going to happen to them? This is true in the developing world too. There's a lot of people who are waiting in line to cash in and gain the dignity and the independence that comes of a job, and we're not actually creating jobs as rapidly as we once did. And so how do we do that? And I happen to think that the only way you can actually do that is if the government plays some kind of a role in addressing it, and then we're going to move. You know, in the early part of the 20th century, 96% of people in the United States worked in farms, and 4% worked in cities and urban areas. It switched. I mean, in industrial activities, it's switched now at the end. We've seen these massive changes happen. I think we're about to see another period where we go from the industrial to the post-industrial, and we have to grapple with all of this. And this is going to involve a real struggle, philosophically, between what is the role of the government and what is the role of the private sector. And I don't think we have the answer, because I think I see too many cracks in every society on this. So I think it's going to continue on. Do we have one more question here? Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Hills, offering me this opportunity, who's sitting in the middle of the people mountain, people sea. And this is Lin from University of Nevada, studying the renewable energy in the peripheral area of the desert. I'm so excited to show up in this humid weather. So since you mentioned the...
You're enjoying the humidity.
Yes, I enjoyed it much. So since you mentioned the residual issues of last century, like the Middle East and Oman, so what do you think are China's disadvantages or advantages of accepting modernity in terms of policy-making process compared to other authoritarian regimes? I know you might be reluctant to comment on China's disadvantages in front of 100 Chinese graduate students. So maybe any suggestions you have?
I'm not reluctant. I'm not reluctant. Look, China has a lot of advantages and it has a lot of disadvantages. I don't. China has a lot of advantages and it has a lot of challenges. I don't know that it has big disadvantages, right? It's got scale. Scale matters. Scale attracts capital. The attraction of capital can fuel growth. It's got extraordinarily smart, talented people who are focusing on education. It's got rapid growth, which keeps it going. Since I've been in Washington, you may have a different view, but since I've been in Washington, every 18 months, somebody has stood up and said, China is about to collapse. You know, China is about to have a catastrophe. And they're always wrong. Because the Chinese leadership, for whatever you may say about the flaws of the Chinese leadership, has actually focused pretty well on what do we have to do in terms of governance that keeps things going forward. And they don't get it all right, and they don't solve every problem, but they solve enough problems that the train keeps chugging down the tracks. And that's a big success. And that, you know, there are authoritarian governments around the world that don't do that don't focus on government, that focus on, you know, the few. Now, look, I mean, China's going through its own issues on corruption and government reform, and it's got to get more representation into the system and so on and so forth, simply so that the nervous system of the country works properly, so that when something's wrong at the center, they know it's wrong, and that when something can be devolved away from the center, it is devolved away from the center. But you know, I think something is happening in China that is actually happening in every country in the world and doesn't get enough focus, and that is whether it's Japan or Indonesia or China or India or the Middle East or Europe or the United States of America, in every country I can think of, the central government's getting a little weaker and city and local governments are getting a little stronger. Because technology lets that happen, because it's often better to solve governing problems closer to the people, that you can flatten organizations a little bit, just like it happens in many corporate structures. And so the sort of decentralization of power is a good thing. China has focused in its effort. It's picked some winners. I think the focus on genomics, the focus on green technology. China invests more money in green technology than every other country in the world added up. Now, it's very super self-interested, right? It's 1 million people die of pollution. You got to go and deal with the problem. But it's going to lead the world in that area because it's self-interested. And ultimately, this is one of the reasons that I'm fairly optimistic. I think that the changes that are going to come to China will not come to China because the world thinks they need to come to China. They will come to China because China discovers it's in their self-interest for them to come to China. And that is true in every country in the world. And we have seen progress over the course of the past 40 years in China that has been absolutely extraordinary in that regard. And I don't expect it to be a straight line forward. But it's that progress that ought to be the sign of the greatest hope. Now, it's a giant, complicated place, and it faces gigantic problems that I don't want to minimize. But I think the mechanisms are in place to begin to address those things. And at the end of the day, the people of China are the big answer. I'll give you one last point on this, which is, that people in the United States, one of the things we do is we say, we're special. One of the reasons that we're special and that we don't fear big countries like China is because we are the innovators, and we're really good at innovating. Well, first of all, that's not true. Every major development of technology that has transformed the world for the past 200 years, with few exceptions, started someplace else and then were adapted and improved here in the United States. And secondly, it's not the innovation that makes America special. We're really good at one thing that China hasn't dealt with yet. We're really good at failure. We have created a society where it's okay to try and fail. We have created a society where you can go bankrupt without being ashamed, where you can go bankrupt and get back up on your feet and start again. Failure is the secret to innovation. Being willing to go and take a risk and not succeed is what leads people to take risks and ultimately to be able to succeed. And no place in the world fails like the United States of America.